Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
My name's Paul, I'm 26, and I've always been the kind of person who tries to keep the peace, especially when it comes to family. My mom used to say I was the easy one. I didn't talk back, didn't argue, and always did what was expected. Maybe that's why my relatives thought they could walk all over me. I let them for a long time, until I realized that being easygoing wasn't the same as being invisible. But the day of my graduation party, the one that was supposed to be about celebrating years of hard work and finally earning my master's degree, was when everything changed. To really understand how things got to that point, you need to know a bit about my family. My Uncle Leonard and Aunt Diane were the type who believed everything had to go their way. Leonard was my mom's older brother, and he had this smug, passive-aggressive tone that made even his compliments sound like insults. Diane, on the other hand, had perfected the art of smiling while cutting you down. I always tried to give them the benefit of the doubt, mostly because they were family and because my mom asked me to. But every family event they hosted came with strings attached, unspoken rules that everyone tiptoed around. For example, if you didn't compliment their house, Diane would mention how some people don't have an eye for design. If you didn't eat her food fast enough, Leonard would point out how not everyone appreciates quality cooking. And if you brought anyone outside the family, even a friend, it became a scandal worthy of whispered discussions for months. It was suffocating, but I learned to play along, at least until the graduation party. It all started when my mom told me Leonard and Diane had offered to host it at their house. I was hesitant because I'd seen what their generosity usually looked like, a trap disguised as a favor. But Mom insisted. They just want to do something nice for you, Paul, she said over the phone. It's your big day. Let them handle it. I sighed, trying not to sound ungrateful. All right, but I want to invite a few friends from university. Just 3 people. Mom hesitated before saying, Of course, honey. I'm sure that'll be fine. Except it wasn't. When I texted Diane to thank her and mentioned I'd be bringing a few friends, she replied, Oh, lovely. We'll see what we can do about that. That phrasing, what we can do about that, immediately made my stomach tighten. It was the kind of polite resistance she used when she didn't actually approve of something. But I ignored the feeling. I was proud of myself, proud of how far I'd come, and I wanted to share that moment with the people who'd supported me through the chaos of late nights, research papers, and burnout. The day of the party arrived warm and bright. I remember the smell of freshly cut grass and grilled food as I pulled into my uncle's driveway, my friends trailing behind me in another car. The decorations were tasteful, gold and navy balloons, a big "Congratulations, Paul" banner hanging near the porch. For a moment, I let myself relax. Maybe, I thought, just maybe they were being genuine for once. Then I saw Diane standing near the entrance, her arms crossed loosely, her lips curved into that polite half-smile that never reached her eyes. Leonard stood beside her, holding a drink and scanning my friends as they got out of the car. They were just 3 of my closest people, my roommate Chris, my classmate Mia, and my best friend from undergrad, Tara. They were all dressed nicely, smiling, carrying small gift bags. Normal guests. But the way Leonard's eyebrows shot up, you'd think I'd brought a horde of strangers demanding free food. Well, he muttered, stepping forward, we didn't plan for extra guests. His tone wasn't angry, but that quiet, judgmental edge carried more weight than if he'd yelled. I felt heat creep up my neck. I told Aunt Diane I'd be bringing them, I said, forcing a calm smile. Just a few friends to celebrate with. Diane's voice was sugary sweet. Of course, dear. I'm sure we can make do. She turned to Leonard with a small laugh that didn't sound like laughter at all. We'll just have to stretch the catering a bit. I wanted to shrink into the ground. My friends exchanged awkward glances, clearly uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off with a chuckle. They don't eat much, I said lightly, hoping humor might diffuse the tension. But Diane just smiled wider. Oh, I'm sure they'll manage. Just try not to make a scene, all right? That was her favorite phrase, try not to make a scene. She used it any time someone dared to express discomfort around her. I bit back a sigh and nodded, leading my friends inside. The atmosphere was odd from the start. My relatives clustered in little groups. whispering as we walked past. My aunt's friends, women with manicured nails and designer handbags, gave my friends polite nods and then turned away to whisper behind cupped hands. Even my cousin Mark, who I used to play video games with as a kid, avoided eye contact. Inside, the food looked fancy: sushi platters, charcuterie boards, and small plates with name cards. But when my friends went to grab a plate, Diane quickly stepped in. "Oh, those are for family first," she said with a smile that could cut glass. "We'll have more set out later." The silence that followed was thick. My friends froze, unsure how to respond. I tried to keep my composure, but inside, something started to burn, a mix of embarrassment and anger. I'd worked so hard to get here, and instead of celebrating, I was standing in the middle of what felt like a performance. My uncle and aunt pretending to be generous hosts while quietly making sure everyone knew their rules. Eventually, dinner was served, buffet style, but with an obvious hierarchy. Family went first, then the secondary guests. By the time my friends made it to the table, most of the expensive sushi platters were half empty, the better dishes gone. Leonard noticed and smirked. "Guess we should have ordered more, huh?" It wasn't just a comment. It was a jab, meant to remind me that my friends didn't belong there. I swallowed my pride, telling myself it wasn't worth a fight. But when I glanced at Tara, who was trying to politely eat around the scraps, something inside me twisted. The night dragged on with passive-aggressive remarks disguised as jokes. "Hope your friends brought gifts," one cousin snickered. "I mean, that's how these things usually work, right?" Another chimed in. "Yeah, we thought this was your celebration, Paul, not a college reunion." I laughed it off, but every word sank deeper. My friends were kind enough not to say anything, but I could feel their discomfort. Mia caught my eye at one point, mouthing, "Are you okay?" I forced a smile, pretending I was. Then came the moment that sealed everything. The server, a young guy probably around my age, came over to check on our table. Leonard leaned toward him and said in that low, dismissive voice, "Make sure the extra guests don't get seconds. We're short on some of the higher-end items." That was it. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my chest tightening. The room suddenly felt smaller, quieter, like everyone was waiting for me to say something. Diane caught my expression and whispered sharply, "Paul, please, try not to make a scene." I looked at her, then at Leonard, and something inside me clicked. That silent realization that enough was enough. All those years of biting my tongue, trying to be the easy one, had led to this moment. So when the server turned to walk away, I stood up. And that's where everything started to change. I stood there for a few seconds, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every eye in that room turned toward me, waiting to see whether I'd stay silent like always or finally push back. I wasn't the type to cause a scene. Diane had made sure of that my whole life. But in that moment, something inside me cracked. I wasn't just embarrassed anymore. I was angry. Not the loud, explosive kind of anger that fades in minutes, but the cold, sharp kind that settles deep and stays. "Actually," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to be heard over the hum of conversation, "the extra guests are the ones who stood by me when I was working 2 jobs to pay for grad school. They deserve a decent meal." A ripple of silence spread across the room. Leonard blinked, clearly not expecting me to talk back. Diane's smile faltered, and her hand twitched toward his arm as if to calm him down before he could respond. My mom looked mortified, clutching her glass tighter. I sat down again, trying to keep my cool, but inside, my thoughts were spinning. I knew that speaking up would cost me something. It always did with this family, but pretending everything was fine had already cost me too much. I just didn't know how far they were willing to go. The rest of the evening unfolded like watching a slow train wreck. My uncle didn't say anything immediately, but I could feel the shift, the subtle whispers, the glances exchanged across the room. It was the kind of tension you could taste. I tried to refocus on my friends, forcing smiles and small talk, but the energy around us was suffocating. When the cake came out, things took another turn. It was beautiful, white frosting, gold letters spelling "Congratulations, Paul." And for a brief second, I thought maybe the night could still be salvaged. But when Diane carried it over, she said with that syrupy tone, We only got enough for family slices, dear. You and your friends can share a smaller one I ordered separately. I stared at her, speechless. My friends exchanged uncomfortable glances again. Mia whispered, "This is insane," under her breath, and I almost laughed from how surreal it all was. I tried to tell myself it wasn't worth reacting to, but then I saw the smaller cake. It was half the size of the main one, stuck awkwardly on the side of the table, with sloppy handwriting on it that said Paul and guests. It wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Chris raised an eyebrow. "They're joking, right?" I shook my head slowly. "No," I said quietly. "They're not." When the server started slicing the main cake and passing it around, I caught Leonard watching me from across the table. There was something smug in his expression, like he was testing me, waiting for me to prove him right, that I was still the polite pushover who'd stay quiet no matter what they did. But what he didn't realize was that I'd already stopped caring about keeping the peace. I didn't make a scene, though. Not yet. I just let the moment sit there, the humiliation soaking in, until even my relatives started to feel the awkwardness of it. One of them, Aunt Carol, leaned over and muttered, "Oh, for heaven's sake, Diane, it's a cake, not gold bullion." Diane gave her a tight smile. Some of us have to plan carefully when people invite unexpected company. The word unexpected echoed in my head like a slap. I could see my mom fidgeting, trying to stay neutral. That was her coping mechanism. Pretend everything's fine, smooth things over later. But this time, I wasn't interested in smoothing anything. After dessert, things got worse. Leonard gathered everyone for a toast. He stood up with his glass raised, smiling in that fake, charming way that only he could pull off. "We're so proud of Paul," he began. "He's come such a long way, and we're thrilled to have been part of his journey." It sounded good on the surface, but I caught the slight emphasis on "we," as if my success somehow belonged to them. Then he added, "It's always a joy to support family when they need it most. Hosting tonight was our little gift. After all, Paul's always been like a son to us." That part stung. My mom smiled weakly, clearly uncomfortable, but Leonard didn't stop. "He's been through some struggles, sure, but we've always been there to guide him. I just hope, as he moves forward, he remembers where he comes from." The implication hit me like a punch. Remember where I come from, as if I owed my achievements to them, as if I hadn't worked every single day for years while they looked down on me. My hands tightened around my glass. I could see my friends exchanging looks, trying to gauge whether I was about to explode. But I didn't. Not yet. I just forced a smile and raised my glass, silently promising myself that if Leonard wanted me to remember, I would, just not in the way he expected. When the formalities ended, the night turned pettier. My cousin Mark started bragging about his new promotion, making sure to compare his salary to what I'd likely make in my field. "You know, business pays better than psychology," he said with a grin. "But hey, at least you'll be good at listening when we need to vent about work." I chuckled dryly. "Yeah, that's me, the family therapist." Mark smirked. "We all need a role, right?" I could tell Diane was enjoying it. She always liked it when someone else did the dirty work. It gave her an excuse to play the innocent hostess while the digs kept coming. Eventually, my mom came over and whispered, "Paul, maybe we should go soon." She looked exhausted, like she'd spent the entire evening walking on eggshells. I wanted to tell her it was fine, that I could handle it, but the truth was, I was reaching my breaking point. Then came the final straw. While my friends and I were helping clean up, because of course, Diane had forgotten to hire enough help, I overheard Leonard talking to a couple of his friends near the kitchen. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when I heard my name, I stopped. "Always so dramatic," Leonard was saying. "Brings his little college friends, eats up our food, then acts like a victim when we run short. You try to help people, and they take advantage." One of his friends laughed. He seemed polite enough. Leonard snorted. "Please. He's been leeching off his mother for years. And now he expects everyone to clap for him because he finally finished school? I mean, Diane and I paid for this whole thing. You'd think he'd at least say thank you." My chest went cold. I hadn't asked them to host anything. I hadn't even wanted them to. But now, in front of his friends, he was painting me as some entitled freeloader. The very thing he'd accused everyone else of being for years. That was it. That was the moment the last bit of patience snapped inside me. I stepped into the doorway before I could stop myself. "Funny," I said, voice steady. "I don't remember asking you to throw this party, Uncle Leonard." He turned, startled, then quickly recovered with a fake laugh. "Paul, didn't see you there. We were just talking about me?" "Yeah, I caught that." I looked around at the others. "You really think I'm ungrateful because I didn't thank you enough? Or because I dared to invite 3 people who actually supported me while I worked my way through grad school without a single dime from this family?" Diane appeared beside him, her expression tight. "Paul, please, not in front of everyone." "No," I said, cutting her off. "You've been telling me to not make a scene my entire life. Maybe it's time for one." The room went silent. My mom looked like she wanted to disappear, but I didn't care anymore. For once, I wanted them to hear how cruel they'd been, how they'd turned every family moment into a competition, how they'd mocked instead of supported, and how they'd used help as a way to control everyone around them. Leonard's smile finally faded. "You're being disrespectful," he said sharply. I took a step closer. "No, I'm being honest. There's a difference." Diane's voice trembled as she tried to regain control. "Paul, we've done nothing but love you, love me." I let out a humorless laugh. "You humiliated my friends in front of everyone. You made sure we were treated like outsiders at my own celebration. And then you talk about me behind my back like I'm some parasite. That's not love." The guests stood frozen, unsure whether to step in or slip away. The air felt heavy, thick with the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Finally, Leonard's mask cracked. "You should be grateful, Paul. You'll understand when you're older that family sacrifices for you, even when you don't appreciate it." That line, "you'll understand when you're older," was one he'd used on me since I was a kid, every time he wanted to excuse his behavior. But this time, it didn't work. I looked him straight in the eye. "Maybe I'll understand when I'm older. Or maybe I'll just stop making excuses for people who treat me like I owe them my dignity." The look on his face, a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief, was almost satisfying. But before I could say more, Diane grabbed his arm. "That's enough," she hissed. "We're not doing this in our home." I turned to leave, motioning for my friends. But as we walked toward the door, Leonard called out, "If you walk out that door, don't expect another thing from us, Paul." I paused, hand on the doorknob, and looked back at him. "That's the best offer you've made all night." And then I left, but not for good. Because that night, I realized something. They'd built their whole sense of power on the idea that no one would ever challenge them, that everyone would just smile and swallow the humiliation. But I was done swallowing it. When I left that house, I didn't look back, not even once. My friends followed me out into the night, silent but supportive, while my mom lingered behind for a few minutes, probably trying to smooth things over like she always did. The drive home felt like hours. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my hands hurt, replaying every word in my head. The way Leonard's voice dripped with superiority, Diane's fake sympathy, the laughter that followed their cruel little jabs. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, I felt hollow. I'd stood up for myself for the first time in my life. But instead of relief, there was this ache in my chest, like something inside me had broken. For years, I'd built my identity around being the peacemaker, the one who let things slide, who didn't fight back. Now that I'd finally done it, I didn't know who I was supposed to be anymore. My friends came upstairs with me. They didn't say much, just helped clean up the leftover decorations I'd planned to bring to the party, but never got to use. Tara ordered takeout, Mia poured some tea, and Chris cracked a few jokes that made me laugh even though I didn't feel like it. They didn't need to say they were proud of me. Their presence said enough. Later that night, my mom called. Her voice was small, almost apologetic. "Paul, honey, your uncle and aunt were just caught off guard. You know how they are." I let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, I do. That's the problem." She sighed softly. "They didn't mean to hurt you. They just—" "Mom," I interrupted gently. "They did mean it. Every comment, every look. They've been doing it for years. You just stopped noticing." There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she whispered, "You're right." It surprised me. My mom rarely admitted things like that. She'd always been the type to minimize conflict, To keep the peace no matter how much it cost her emotionally. For her to say those words meant she'd finally seen what I'd been feeling all along. Still, I didn't blame her. She'd grown up in Leonard's shadow, always compared to him, always told she was the sensitive one. I could tell she wanted to fix everything, but for the first time in my life, I didn't want her to. I just needed distance. Over the next few weeks, I cut contact with Leonard and Diane completely. No texts, no calls, nothing. At first, it felt strange, like I was breaking some invisible family rule. But then it started to feel liberating. The quiet was peaceful. I poured myself into work. I'd recently landed a position as a research assistant at a behavioral health clinic. Not glamorous, but meaningful. It paid enough to cover rent and let me save a little each month. My coworkers were kind, genuine people who valued my input. They didn't care about appearances or social status. They cared about results, empathy, and effort. It was the first time I'd felt seen for what I could do, not who I was related to. Still, the humiliation from that party lingered like a bruise. I avoided social media for a while, afraid someone had posted pictures or gossip. But when I finally logged in, the first thing I saw was a tagged post from my cousin Mark. A photo of him, Leonard, and Diane smiling beside the cake, the main one, with the caption, "Family means showing up for each other. Congrats to our favorite grad, Paul." Couldn't be prouder. My stomach turned. The post had dozens of likes and comments from extended relatives saying how wonderful they all looked. It was like the entire night had been rewritten into some glossy PR version of reality where they were the generous hosts and I was the grateful recipient of their kindness. I didn't comment. I didn't even untag myself. I just saved the post, quietly. Something in me shifted then. A part of me that had been content to walk away started to plan. Not revenge yet, not exactly, but something. Months passed. I worked hard, stayed focused, and slowly began to rebuild my confidence. Every morning I'd wake up early, run through the park near my apartment, and remind myself that peace wasn't something people could give or take. It was something I had to claim. My therapist once told me that boundaries were the purest form of self-respect, and I was finally beginning to understand what that meant. Still, I couldn't escape the pull of family. The holidays came, and with them, the inevitable invitations. My mom asked gently, "Would you at least come to Christmas dinner? They want to talk." I shook my head. They want to pretend nothing happened. She didn't argue. She just looked sad in that quiet, resigned way she always did when the family fractured. I told her I'd see her separately, and we ended up spending Christmas Eve together at my place. Just the two of us, watching old movies and eating pasta. It was simple, warm, and peaceful. No judgment, no whispered comments, no expectations. That night, she said something that stuck with me. "You know, your uncle may have money and connections, but he's never been happy. People like him need control to feel important. Take that away, and they fall apart." Her words echoed in my mind for weeks after. I realized she was right. Leonard and Diane's power came from how much people played along. Their version of the truth only worked because no one ever challenged it. But I was done playing their game. The new year brought opportunities one hadn't expected. My supervisor at the clinic encouraged me to apply for a grant to fund an independent project, a community program to provide free mental health workshops for underprivileged youth. I worked tirelessly on the proposal, putting everything I'd learned into it. When I finally got the approval letter, I just sat there staring at it, tears blurring the words. I'd done it. On my own. The project grew faster than I expected. Within 6 months, we were running weekly sessions in 3 different neighborhoods, partnering with schools and local organizations. I was still young, still figuring things out, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was actually making a difference. People respected me for what I did, not who my family was. My mom was proud, genuinely proud. She told me she'd shown Leonard one of the articles written about my program, and his reaction had been priceless. Apparently, he tried to downplay it at first, saying, "It's nice he's keeping busy." But when the local paper interviewed me and mentioned the grant amount, a sizable 6 figures, his tone reportedly changed. Suddenly, I wasn't the struggling student anymore. I was the relative he hadn't expected to succeed without him. That's when the phone calls started. First Diane. Her voice was sweet, cautious. "Paul, it's been so long. We've all missed you. We were just talking about how we should get together soon. Celebrate everything you've accomplished." I smiled to myself. "That's kind of you and Diane, but I'm really busy these days." "Oh, of course. We understand completely. Maybe just a dinner, then?" Leonard was saying we never properly apologized for the misunderstanding at your graduation party. I paused. "A misunderstanding?" She hesitated. "Well, you know how people can overreact sometimes. We never meant for you to feel uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. That was her word for public humiliation, favoritism, and backhanded insults. I could almost see her tight smile through the phone. "I appreciate that," I said finally. "I'll think about it." I didn't. But I did start to think about something else, about how much their approval had controlled my life for so long, and how freeing it felt to know I didn't need it anymore. I'd built something real, something lasting, without them, and I wasn't done yet. About a year later, things came full circle in the most unexpected way. My program had expanded statewide, and I was invited to speak at a major conference. The keynote panel was being hosted at, of all places, the same event center Leonard's company often used for its annual galas. When I saw the address, I actually laughed out loud. I accepted the invitation immediately. The weeks leading up to the event were a blur of preparation, presentations, interviews, meetings with sponsors. Somewhere in the middle of it, I got a message from my mom. "Your uncle heard about your keynote. He's attending." Of course he was. And that was when I realized the universe had just handed me an opportunity, one I hadn't even been looking for. It wasn't about revenge in the dramatic, movie-style sense. I didn't want to ruin Leonard or Diane. I just wanted the truth to stand on its own, in front of the same kind of people they used to impress by tearing others down. But as the conference approached, I couldn't help but remember the look on Leonard's face that night at the party, that mix of disdain and disbelief when I finally stood up for myself. It fueled me, reminded me why I'd started down this path in the first place. Because people like him thrived on silence. And I wasn't silent anymore. The morning of the keynote, I stood backstage, adjusting my notes. The room beyond the curtain was packed: community leaders, investors, mental health professionals. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, then glanced toward the crowd as they started seating. And there he was, Leonard, sitting near the front with Diane beside him, both of them smiling that same polite, performative smile. They hadn't changed a bit, but I had. The first time I really allowed myself to think about revenge, I didn't picture some messy confrontation or a public meltdown. No, it had to be smart, deliberate, and cold. A series of moves that would make Leonard and Diane realize exactly how little control they had over me now. It wasn't about hurting them for the sake of it. It was about rewriting the narrative they'd spent decades trying to enforce. If they thought they could humiliate me, dictate who I could celebrate with, and then claim moral superiority, they were about to learn a lesson in patience, planning, and precision. The idea first hit me during a quiet evening at my apartment. My mom had come over for dinner. We'd made it a tradition after the fallout of my graduation party, and we were sitting at the small kitchen table, talking about nothing in particular, when I casually mentioned the keynote event I was preparing for. She looked proud, but also nervous, as if she was already anticipating Leonard's reaction. "You know, they're going to show up," she said, stirring her tea. "Leonard and Diane. They're very competitive." I smiled faintly. "Let them come." She looked at me sharply. "Paul, you know what they're like. You can't just let them." "Mom, it's not about letting them," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "It's about making sure they don't get away with it this time. I've spent too long walking on eggshells for people who thrive on other people's discomfort. They need to see that the rules have changed." She fell silent after that, and I could tell she was both worried and impressed, maybe even a little relieved. For years, she had endured Leonard's manipulations too, silently and politely. But she didn't have my energy, my drive, or the quiet, simmering resentment I'd stored for over a decade. I started making notes, little observations, tiny seeds for a future plan. Every slight, every insult, every subtle act of exclusion that had been part of my life became a piece of a puzzle. I kept them in a private journal, not out of obsession, but to remind myself of the patterns. How Leonard always sought to assert dominance through financial displays, how Diane weaponized politeness, how they relied on the fear of social embarrassment to control people. Next, I needed allies. I didn't want to go it alone. My friends, Chris, Tara, and Mia, had always been there, quietly supporting me, and I trusted them implicitly. I shared the story of my graduation party with them once again, in full detail, not as a complaint, but as a blueprint of the toxic environment I'd endured. Chris, practical as always, started brainstorming logistics. Tara, who had a knack for research, began digging into Leonard and Diane's business dealings, their companies, their public events, charity functions, anything that could be leveraged without illegal or reckless actions. Mia, who was calm under pressure, offered advice on timing and presentation. It quickly became clear that revenge, in the way I wanted it, wasn't about confrontation. It was about exposure and control. Leonard thrived on appearances, on crafting an image of success and moral superiority. Diane's power came from social manipulation. If I could dismantle that carefully curated image, subtly, elegantly, without overt aggression, I'd win in a way they couldn't anticipate. I began attending local charity events, networking with influential people in the same circles Leonard often flaunted himself in. I didn't act differently. I acted strategically. Conversations, introductions, emails, all seemingly casual, but I was learning the dynamics of influence, the unspoken hierarchy of social capital. Every handshake, every smile, every networking dinner became a move in a chess game I was only beginning to understand. Meanwhile, I kept building my own success. My mental health workshops grew, attracting more funding and media attention. I started giving talks at universities, community centers, even small conferences. With each milestone, I quietly documented everything. Photos, press clippings, email confirmations, the kind of evidence that, when presented correctly, would demonstrate a stark contrast to Leonard and Diane's narrative. But it wasn't enough to simply succeed. I needed the right stage, the perfect moment when their overconfidence would be their downfall. That keynote event, the very one being held at a venue they were familiar with, presented itself as an ideal opportunity. It wasn't just about showing up. It was about orchestrating a scenario where they'd be forced to witness my accomplishments firsthand, without the ability to twist the story or control the optics. I even thought about the small, psychological details, where they'd sit, how they'd perceive the crowd, the reactions of others around them. Every subtle action could be amplified. Leonard and Diane loved public approval, but they could crumble under a spotlight that highlighted their hypocrisy, and I intended to shine it exactly where it hurt. At the same time, I nurtured the personal side of my revenge, the emotional resilience I'd need. I spent mornings running, afternoons meditating, evenings reading everything I could about social dynamics and leadership. My friends held me accountable, making sure that I stayed strategic rather than reactive. I couldn't afford to act impulsively. A single mistake could ruin everything. It wasn't just about Leonard and Diane anymore. It was about reclaiming control over my own narrative. I realized that I had been complicit in their control for years, letting fear of judgment dictate my choices. Now, I had leverage, not malicious leverage, but power earned through genuine achievement, respect from my peers, and a growing network that even Leonard couldn't touch. I also found ways to subtly test their reactions over the following months. When an article about my program appeared in a prominent local newspaper, I casually sent a copy to my mom, who forwarded it to Leonard and Diane. Their responses were revealing. Diane called me modest and determined, while Leonard's reply was a terse, interesting. We'll see how far he really goes. That little, we'll see, told me everything. He felt threatened, though he'd never admitted openly. Then came another stroke of luck. One of my workshop participants was connected to a conference planning committee that hosted high-profile events, the kind Leonard usually bragged about attending. I cultivated that relationship quietly, offering insights and guidance, slowly positioning myself as someone indispensable without him realizing it. Within weeks, I was formally invited to speak, the keynote, at a venue Leonard's company frequently booked for their annual gala. It was perfect. The stage was mine. The audience would be influential, and Leonard and Diane would be sitting in the front row, expecting to watch me squirm or, at best, fail politely. But instead, I would deliver a presentation that underscored my competence, my independence, and the respect I'd earned without ever asking for their approval. I spent nights rehearsing, not just my speech, but my demeanor. Calm, composed, authoritative. Every slide, every anecdote, every story about the lives I'd impacted was designed to demonstrate my worth objectively, irrefutably. I wasn't angry in my presentation. I was confident. My achievements spoke louder than any argument, and I knew the audience, including my relatives, would see that. I also considered the timing. If I executed it perfectly, Leonard and Diane would be trapped between admiration and frustration, unable to reconcile their inflated sense of superiority with the undeniable evidence of my accomplishments. That tension would be priceless. Finally, I created contingency plans. What if Leonard tried to intervene? What if Diane attempted to undermine me publicly? I had allies among the staff and organizers, discreetly briefed to ensure I wouldn't be interrupted. I had backup materials, supporting documentation, testimonials, everything to protect the narrative I'd spent months building. As the day approached, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and calm. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to the family dynamics. I was controlling them. Every move was mine to make, every outcome within reach. For years, Leonard and Diane had taught me that family meant rules, hierarchy, and obedience. Now, I was rewriting those rules. The morning of the event, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie and smoothing my jacket. I caught my reflection and smiled faintly. The nervous, people-pleasing Paul who'd allowed family to dictate his worth was gone. In his place was someone strategic, composed, and quietly ruthless in the most civilized way possible. Someone who could finally turn the tables without losing his integrity. I glanced at my notes one last time and remembered that night at my graduation party. The humiliation, the whispered warnings, the forced politeness. Every slight, every comment, every sneer had led me here. And now, it was their turn to feel the sting of consequences. Not through yelling or public shaming, but through undeniable reality. I had succeeded without them. I had thrived, and there was nothing they could do to undo it. As the event hall doors opened and the guests began to arrive, I felt a sense of satisfaction settle over me. I had the perfect opportunity, the perfect plan, and the perfect audience. All I needed now was the execution. And in the front row, I knew, sat Leonard and Diane, oblivious to the storm I was about to unleash. When I first pictured the moment of payoff, I imagined something noisy, a scene, a confrontation, fireworks. What unfolded was nothing like that. It was quieter, cleaner, and 1,000 times more effective because it moved like water, slow, patient, and impossible to stop once it found the cracks. I didn't want their collapse to feel like spectacle. I wanted it to feel inevitable. I wanted the truth to arrive at their door dressed as ordinary life and watch them try, and fail, to spin it into the narrative they preferred. The morning of the event, everything went according to plan. My speech was tight, the slides seamless, and when I walked on stage, the nervous flutter I used to get was gone, replaced by a steady pulse of certainty. I spoke about community, about dignity, about how people rebuild after trauma. Not the dramatic kind that looks good in films, but the quiet, persistent work you do when no one is watching. I told stories of teens who'd stopped thinking school mattered until one workshop gave them a reason not to quit. I told anecdotes about parents who learned new ways to listen. No personal attacks, no gossip, just measurable outcomes, testimonials, and data that showed the program had changed lives. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. Leonard and Diane were there, as expected, in the front row. They were smiling in that practiced way that previously would have disarmed me. Diane prim and proper, Leonard scanning the room as if sizing up an enemy. I made eye contact for a second, acknowledged them with a polite nod, and then moved on. The audience loved it. The applause was warm and steady. Investors who had been on the fence reached out afterward. A local news station interviewed me that afternoon. Everything I'd built all those months, the programs, the testimonials, the press, was now impossible to dismiss as a fluke or a charity stunt. The first crack wasn't from my speech. It was from what I'd quietly arranged beforehand. Months earlier, Tara had helped me compile a dossier, not dirt, just facts. Copies of contracts, invoices from Leonard's favored caterer that didn't match the amounts he claimed to have donated to various charities. Email threads showing Diane requesting family-only menus for multiple events. Minutes from a small nonprofit board meeting where Leonard had repeatedly pressured organizers to give his company preferential contracts. I don't like conspiracies or trapping people. I like documents. People with reputations to protect often rely on memory and posture. Documents don't forget. I handed those files to a journalist I trusted, someone known for meticulous, dry reporting rather than sensationalism. I asked only that she verify everything. She did. Subpoenaed records were necessary, spoke to vendors who'd been afraid to speak up, and confirmed that several gifts Leonard had touted were actually credits against services and not outright donations. It wasn't glamorous. It was receipts and line items and the kind of accounting details that scream hypocrisy once they're in a printed story. When the article ran, it was framed as an investigative piece about conflicts of interest between local businesses and charities. Leonard's name was there, factual and unemotional. Diane was quoted, in the familiar syrupy voice she used at brunches, insisting they'd only ever acted in good faith. The paper included images of invoices and redacted emails. Most importantly, it included statements from two vendors who'd quietly confirmed that Leonard's donations often came with strings, favorable contracts, waived fees for his associates, and a pattern of public praise followed by private pressure. What followed was a slow, piling topple. The nonprofit that had awarded Leonard's company a plaque started an internal review. Sponsors who'd once competed to be at Leonard's events suddenly wanted distance. An investor I'd met at the conference contacted me privately to say his firm was reconsidering a potential partnership with Leonard's company because of the press. Leonard tried to call me, once, twice, but I let the calls go to voicemail. I wasn't interested in an argument. I wanted the facts to speak. Diane's social circle evaporated the way fog does under sun. The women who had once flanked her at luncheons started avoiding invites because they didn't want to be associated with someone whose reputation might endanger their own charity boards. Leonard's business partners issued carefully worded statements. We are reviewing our affiliations, and in the corridors of the companies that mattered, people who had gladly eaten his catered meals began asking each other, quietly, why they had never looked more closely at the contracts. At family gatherings, the dynamics changed too. Word spread before I ever announced anything to my relatives. Leonard was under investigation by his board. Diane had lost two of her most dependable social sponsors. Suddenly, the "we did so much for Paul" narrative had a faint, embarrassing rust at the edges. The very people who had used generosity as proof of character found that generosity examined under a microscope did not always hold up. My mother called one morning, voice small and shaky. They reached out to you, she said. Leonard says it's all a misunderstanding. Diane is, she paused, searching for the word. She's having a hard time. I could hear the moral contortion in her tone, the same one she used when she tried to explain away their cruelty in the past. This time I didn't try to fix her feelings. She'd seen the evidence. She knew. That knowledge quieted her. Maybe it freed her a little, too. Leonard tried countermeasures, of course. He donated another sum to a different charity and issued a press release about his lifelong commitment to community service. He arranged a staged photo op with local officials and a giant ceremonial check. Diane made the rounds, smiling into cameras and repeating the same lines about family and generosity. But there's a laziness to performative gestures. When the bedrock is shaky, no amount of smiling covers the sound of the foundations shifting. At work, my allies made sure things happened in a way that protected me and the cause. When a local grant committee reached out to follow up on funding for my program, they were greeted not by slick PR, but by parents whose lives had changed. I had no interest in rubbing salt in blood. I wanted repair. That repair came when donors and partners approached me with offers not because they felt sorry, but because they believed in the work. That moral clarity felt like a different kind of victory, one that didn't require me to humiliate anyone to be effective. In the weeks after the story, family members approached me with a variety of tones. My cousin Mark texted something tentative about meeting up to talk. Aunt Carol called and expressed regret that things had gone so far. My mother cried and said she was tired of choosing sides. Most important, Diane contacted me, not with anger, but with a pleading voice that somehow suggested she felt hollowed out. "Paul," she said, "I think we've made mistakes. Can we talk?" I listened, which is more than I used to do in those situations. She cried, her voice small, the armor finally off. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a complicated mix of pity and distance. Pity, because I recognized the same fears that had made them cruel. Distance, because I'd learned that cheerful apologies often substituted for change. There were supporters for Leonard, of course. People who wanted to defend him, who saw the articles as attacks and called it cancel culture. That didn't change the tangible effects. Vendors renegotiated contracts or simply moved on. Board members stepped down. The company's stock, if it had been publicly traded, would have shown the fluctuation of investor trust. For a man who measured power in nods and curtained compliments, the quiet withdrawals were worse than any public shaming. But this story isn't about revenge as punishment. It's about rebalancing power. When Leonard's influence waned, the opportunities he used to hoard became available to people who'd actually earned them. Diane's lunches emptying out mint space for others to lead charity committees with less ego and more service. My program received more funding, not because I wanted to win, but because the community realized what actually mattered. The fallout within the family was messy and real. Some relished the change and asked for mea culpas. Others doubled down into silence. My mom and I had long conversations about loyalty and self-preservation. I learned boundaries that didn't feel like punishments, but like muscles I could use to keep myself healthy. My friends never asked for anything in return. They were there because they'd always been there. Chris joked that we should get matching t-shirts, and though I laughed, I also felt grateful in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be before. One evening, a month after the article, I ran into Leonard at a community fundraiser, an event he once would have dominated. He stood at the back, watching from the margins like someone trying to find his old place in a room that had rearranged itself. He caught my eye, and for the first time I noticed how small he looked when he wasn't surrounded by the people he'd curated. He walked over, a practiced smile ready, but the line that came tasted less confident than I remembered. "You did well," he said, and for a beat I thought it might be something like pressure or threat. Instead, it was complicated, maybe an admission he couldn't quite form. We weren't expecting all of that. He attempted a laugh that sounded like a cough. "Congratulations." I could have said 100 things, the pithy one-liner, the cold reminder of every slight. Instead, I looked at him and felt the full arc of the last year. The humiliation, the planning, the slow build-up, and the eventual, quiet justice that didn't require spectacle. "Thank you," I said. "I did it with a lot of help." He nodded, and the exchange ended there. No victory lap, no dramatic mic drop. It was a small, human moment of recognition. That, in itself, felt like closure. In the months that followed, life settled into a steady rhythm. My workshops expanded, more kids enrolled, and the work continued to matter. I reconnected with my mom on better terms, boundaries in place, affection intact without the price of humiliation. The family, fractured as it was, had to learn to navigate a new balance of power. Some relationships healed, some did not. That was okay. I had spent years wanting approval from people who didn't know how to give it in a healthy way. I had finally built a life that didn't depend on their nod. On a quieter note, sometimes when I walked past the park where I used to run, I would think of the graduation party, the small cake on the side table, the server told not to bring seconds, the whispered jokes. Once those memories no longer had the sting of shame, they served a different purpose. They reminded me how far I'd come, not because I had proven them wrong, but because I had stopped centering my life around their opinion. The revenge I engineered wasn't cruel. It wasn't theatrical. It was just the slow, methodical exposure of a house of cards, done in paperwork and press, patience and persistence. It felt oddly clinical and yet deeply human. People who had been taught to wield power as performative charity were forced, at last, to face the consequences of the structures they'd propped up. They lost some privileges. Others found themselves with more time to consider why they'd loved those privileges so much. On a warm evening a year later, I sat on my small balcony with a cup of tea and a book. My phone buzzed with a message from Tara, a simple photo of us at a community celebration, beaming kids around us. I looked out at the city and thought about lineage and dignity and the quiet work of choosing who you are on purpose. The gratitude I felt then wasn't the shy, provisional kind I'd once offered for approval. It was steady. Leonard and Diane faded from center stage, not with a scream, but with the slow unspooling of attention. That, more than any spectacle, was the unraveling I'd wanted. A life that no longer ran on fear of judgment, but on actual merit. The last thing I wanted from the whole ordeal was to become like them. I had been a mess of rage and hurt at times, sure, but the person who walked away from that house the first time and never looked back was not the same man who stood on stage with a keynote and calm resolve. I'd traded silence for something healthier. Results, boundaries, and the company of people who loved me without asking for my dignity as collateral. When the dust settled and the accounts were balanced and the press cycle moved on, the only lingering victory that truly mattered sat across from me at my little kitchen table. My mother's quiet, tearful smile when she said she was proud of me, not because of a party, but because of who I was choosing to be. I closed my book, looked at the teacup cooling in my hand, and thought of that night, the one where I finally stood up, and the long, patient plan that followed. It hadn't been about hurting them. It had been about not letting them hurt anyone else with their version of generosity. I let the thought sit with me for a moment, simple and complete. Then I turned off the light, and for the first time in a very long time, slept without the weight of expectation pressing on my chest. My name is Nick. I'm 27, and I've spent most of my life feeling like the invisible member of my own family. Growing up, my parents and sister had this rhythm, a pattern where my sister, Rachel, got away with everything, and I somehow ended up being the one to take the blame for minor slip-ups or even things that weren't my fault. Mom never exactly sided with her, but she had this weird way of staying quiet, like she thought witnessing the injustice was the same as doing something about it. Rachel's always been the kind of person who could make a room revolve around her, who could turn a slight inconvenience into a personal tragedy and somehow make herself the hero at the same time. And me? I was just there, absorbing the chaos, trying not to make waves. It's funny how the little things pile up over time until one day they're no longer small. That's exactly where I was last weekend, sitting at the dining table with Mom and Rachel after a relatively uneventful dinner that my sister had helped make, although her idea of helping mostly involved delegating the actual work to me. I'm not exaggerating when I say she turned every single moment into a performance. She criticized the way I chopped vegetables, the way I set the plates, even the way I poured the water. Mom just sat there, silent, twirling her fork like she didn't want to be part of any argument. The first spark of real tension that night wasn't even about food. Rachel had been borrowing my laptop earlier in the week without asking and had somehow managed to delete a project I'd been working on for months. Not on purpose. Or at least, that's what she claimed, but she didn't think to tell me, either. When I confronted her about it, she rolled her eyes, threw her hands up, and said, "You always make everything into a huge deal. Stop acting like the world revolves around you." Classic. The gaslighting, the manipulation, it had been the family pattern since I could remember. But that night, something inside me snapped. I was done silently swallowing my frustration, done being the punching bag, the convenient scapegoat. I told her calmly, "Rachel, I'm not acting. This is serious. You deleted my work, and it's not acceptable. I need you to acknowledge that and apologize." She leaned back in her chair, smirking like she had already won the argument just by existing. "Oh, please. You always make yourself the victim. You're impossible. That line, her favorite line, was like nails on a chalkboard at this point. I could feel my blood pressure rising, and something I hadn't done in a long time bubbled up inside me. I wanted her to face the truth, and I wanted Mom to finally witness it. I took a deep breath and reached into my pocket. I had been planning this quietly for weeks, not in some elaborate revenge plot, but in a way that was undeniable. I pulled out my phone, tapped a few times, and set it on the table. "Tell the truth about what you did or leave right now," I said, keeping my voice steady. My heart was racing, and I could see Rachel's smirk falter just a fraction. Mom's fork stopped midair. Silence fell, thick and heavy, the kind that makes every second feel like an hour. I hit play. Seconds later, Rachel's voice filled the room. It wasn't the mockery or excuses I had heard before. It was her, admitting things she had always denied, saying things she'd never own up to in front of anyone, let alone Mom. The moment was electric. I could see Rachel's face drain of color, her usual confidence crumbling as she realized she couldn't talk her way out of this one. Mom, finally, looked up, and for the first time in years, I felt her actually seeing me, not as the background character in Rachel's story, but as a person who had been pushed around for too long. I could feel the tension radiating off Rachel in waves. She opened her mouth to interrupt, probably thinking she could charm or gaslight her way out like usual. But the recording kept playing, cutting her off. Every denial, every accusation she had thrown at me over the years was now exposed for what it was. And yet, she didn't yell, didn't storm off, at least, not immediately. She just froze, eyes darting between me and Mom, the silence in the room stretching into a painful, almost unbearable length. That night, as I watched her struggle to regain control, I realized something. This wasn't just about the laptop or that project. It was about years of frustration, of being minimized, of being told I was too sensitive or too dramatic whenever I stood up for myself. It was about finally having the evidence, the proof, the undeniable moment where Rachel's facade cracked, even if just slightly. And I could feel, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The scales were finally tipping, and I wasn't going to let this moment slip away. After that night, the atmosphere in our house shifted, though not in a way that felt immediately satisfying. There wasn't an instant confrontation or dramatic shouting match, the kind you see in movies, but a slow, simmering tension that made every interaction feel charged, fragile, like the house itself was holding its breath. Rachel avoided me as much as she could, moving through rooms silently, her eyes always darting in my direction before snapping away. Mom, as usual, didn't intervene. She still spoke to both of us politely, but there was a distance in her gaze that hadn't been there before, like she was processing something, or maybe just waiting for me to overreact. I spent most of the next few days quietly observing. I didn't need to chase Rachel down or argue. I let her do the heavy lifting of trying to reassert her control. And true to form, she did not disappoint. At first, it was small things. She'd interrupt me during family meals, claiming to correct something I said, even when I was stating facts. She would accidentally take the things I needed in the kitchen for her projects or assignments, leaving me scrambling. I would catch her smirking at me from across the room as if the previous confrontation had never happened, as if the recording hadn't exposed her. Mom, again, watched quietly. It was maddening, like living in a house where the walls themselves were siding with her. The next real spark came over a trivial matter that somehow became monumental in Rachel's mind. I had reserved a time slot at the local gym, a rare window I could take for myself since I was training for a 10K race. Rachel needed to go at the exact same time, claiming her workout was more important because she was doing it for a school project, or so she said. When I refused to give up my time, she launched into a tirade about how selfish I was, how I always put myself first, and how Mom had taught me wrong by allowing me to hog opportunities. She said it all with this venomous calm, the kind of tone that makes you freeze because it feels like she's rewriting history while you're supposed to nod in agreement. I stood there, fists clenched, trying not to react, because I knew that was exactly what she wanted, a reaction I could later twist against me. Mom finally said something that day, though it wasn't helpful. Nick, maybe you can compromise, she suggested, her voice soft but heavy with a kind of passive disapproval that made my stomach twist. Compromise? After everything, compromise now felt like conceding again. But I said nothing, only nodded, quietly seething. I didn't give up my gym slot. Rachel stomped off, muttering under her breath about how I never considered anyone but myself. It didn't stop there. Over the next week, she started escalating more aggressively. She would borrow things of mine and then deny ever touching them. She'd mock my interests openly, calling them childish or pointless, especially in front of Mom. The more she did it, the more Mom stayed silent. The more I felt the unfairness stacking like bricks on my chest. Every small slight felt amplified because of everything that had happened that night with the recording. It should have been a turning point, a moment of accountability, but instead, it seemed like it had only angered her and made her more cunning. Then came the incident that changed everything. I don't even know how to fully describe it without feeling a spike of anger all over again. It was Saturday morning. I had a job interview for a position I'd been working toward for months, a role that would finally give me some independence and the financial freedom I'd been craving. I'd left my folder with my resume and references on my desk, ready to take it with me. I went to make a cup of coffee, came back, and the folder was gone. I didn't panic at first. I tried to rationalize. Maybe I had moved it. Maybe it had fallen behind the desk. But deep down, I knew better. I went into the living room and found Rachel, casually scrolling her phone, the folder neatly tucked under her arm. She looked up at me with this smug expression, like she was catching me at something embarrassing. "Looking for this?" she asked sweetly, her voice dripping with mock innocence. My stomach dropped, and I could feel my pulse spike. "Rachel, give that back. I need it," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. But there was a tremor I couldn't hide. "Oh, this?" she laughed, tossing it slightly in the air before catching it again. "You don't even need it today. I'm doing you a favor. Don't thank me, please." Her smirk was infuriating. Mom watched from the corner, as always, quietly, and I could feel my jaw tighten. "This isn't funny. This is serious. I have an interview, and you're jeopardizing it," I said, stepping closer, trying to assert control without exploding. "You're always so dramatic," she said, shrugging as if my very life depended on her whims. "I mean, come on, Nick, it's just a folder. Don't act like I ruined your whole career." Her words were poisonous. And in that moment, something broke in me. I realized that this wasn't just Rachel being a spoiled sister. This was a pattern of entitlement, manipulation, and cruelty that had been allowed to fester because Mom refused to intervene. I was done being the reasonable one while she threw my life and feelings under the bus. I reached for the folder, but she yanked it back just out of reach, giggling. I could feel my frustration boiling into something I couldn't ignore. My hands shook, my chest tightened, and I could sense that if I let this moment pass without a response, she would continue believing she could control everything. I thought back to the recording, the proof of all her lies, her manipulation, her endless excuses. That night had been a small victory, but now I knew I needed more than a recording. I needed a way to make sure she couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep undermining me. Before I could act, she leaned back on the couch, still holding the folder, and whispered something that made my blood run cold. "You'll never get ahead while you keep playing by the rules, Nick. You're too predictable, too weak. Maybe that's why Mom always protects me and lets me do whatever I want." Her words weren't just cruel. They were an accusation, a judgment, and a warning all at once. And for the first time, I saw clearly that Mom's silence wasn't just neutrality. It was tacit approval. It was enabling. It was the final straw. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to process what I had just heard. My mind raced with possibilities. Could I confront both of them at once? Could I finally break through to Mom, make her see what I had been enduring for years? Or was this the moment I had to start protecting myself in ways I hadn't yet considered? The next few hours were a blur of suppressed anger, pacing, and planning. I couldn't leave the folder there. I couldn't let her continue thinking she could humiliate me with impunity. I had to find a way to reclaim control without giving her the satisfaction of a full-blown argument, something that would let her manipulate the narrative again. My emotions were tangled: fear, anger, hurt, and a strange, building determination all at once. Finally, I realized the reality of my situation. This wasn't just a fight over a folder or a single interview. This was the culmination of years of favoritism, gaslighting, and manipulation. Rachel had always had the upper hand, and Mom's quiet complicity had reinforced it. But now, I had a chance to shift the balance, to create a moment where the truth couldn't be denied, where I could finally assert myself in a way that couldn't be twisted, lied about, or erased. And just as I was planning my next move, Rachel did something so unexpected, so shocking, that it nearly knocked me off my feet. She didn't just hold the folder out of my reach. She opened it, pulled out my resume, and ripped it in half. Not just a quick tear, but a deliberate, almost ceremonial destruction, crumpling the pages into tiny pieces before letting them fall to the floor like confetti. I froze. My mouth went dry. The room seemed to tilt. Mom gasped softly, but she still didn't intervene. Rachel looked at me with that same smug, unflinching expression. Guess you're not getting that job now, Nick. Maybe you should have learned sooner that you can't always win. In that moment, everything inside me screamed. All the years of quiet endurance, all the times I swallowed my pride to keep the peace, all the little humiliations and subtle betrayals, they coalesced into one sharp, undeniable reality. Things had to change, and I had to make sure this time there would be no doubt about who was in control. After Rachel tore my resume apart, the house felt smaller, heavier, like the walls themselves were pressing in, suffocating me. I sat on my bed for what felt like hours, staring at the crumpled scraps on the floor and trying to breathe without letting my panic show. I'd been so close to stepping into something that could change my life, and in a single, calculated moment, she'd stolen it from me. It wasn't just an attack on a piece of paper. It was an attack on my ability to succeed, on my independence, on the very idea that I could carve a life separate from the family dynamic that had kept me small for years. I wanted to shout. I wanted to throw things. I wanted to make her feel even a fraction of the humiliation and anger I was swallowing whole. But I didn't. I knew from years of experience that any immediate reaction would only feed her, only prove her right in her twisted little narrative that I was weak, emotional, and incapable of standing up for myself without losing control. So instead, I did the hardest thing. I left. Not dramatically, not in some grand gesture, just quietly slipping out of the house, closing the door behind me, and letting the world outside swallow me up. The streets were cold, the wind biting, and for a moment, I let myself feel defeated. I walked for hours, circling neighborhoods, running through every scenario in my head. How had I let it get this far? How had I let her, or Mom, make me feel powerless? I realized something crucial in that walk. The problem wasn't just Rachel. It was me. I had spent years bending to the whims of a person who thrived on control, quietly accepting Mom's neutrality, thinking it was safer to keep the peace than to assert my own boundaries. And now, here I was, raw and exposed, realizing that if I didn't make a change, nothing would ever be different. I hit rock bottom that night. I sat on a park bench, hunched over, shivering despite my jacket, staring at my phone, thinking of all the doors Rachel had closed for me with one flick of her hand. But amid the despair, a small, stubborn spark ignited. If Rachel wanted to play games, I could play them too, but smarter, quieter, more strategically. I couldn't control her actions, and I couldn't force Mom to act differently, but I could control myself. I could build a life outside of their approval, outside of their manipulation, and for the first time in years, I felt a surge of clarity. The first step was practical. I found a small cafe with free Wi-Fi and a quiet corner. I started reconstructing my resume, this time meticulously, going over every detail to make it stronger, sharper. I realized that Rachel's destruction had been a setback, but not a permanent one. The world outside my house didn't care about the scraps of paper or the petty power plays. Opportunities existed regardless of her interference, but only if I was proactive. I stayed at the cafe late into the night, rewriting cover letters, researching companies, and mapping out a plan that was far more comprehensive than the original. I wasn't just rebuilding my resume. I was rebuilding my confidence, brick by brick. The next morning, I took it a step further. I enrolled in a few online courses related to my field, things I'd been hesitant to commit to because of time, money, or self-doubt. Every module I completed felt like a small victory, like reclaiming a piece of the self-esteem Rachel had tried to crush. I made spreadsheets, set goals, tracked progress, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control over my life. No one in my family had a say in this process. This was mine. Rachel, of course, noticed the shift. She started trying to provoke me in subtle ways, commenting on my routines, mocking the time I spent at the cafe, making snide remarks about how busy you are pretending to be productive. But her attempts didn't sting like they used to. I had learned to detach, to let her words wash over me without giving them weight. Mom still stayed quiet, glancing between us, but I no longer sought her approval or feared her judgment. The silence that had once felt suffocating now felt neutral, almost liberating. Over the next few weeks, I began taking concrete steps to reclaim my independence. I applied to multiple jobs, networked with professionals in my field, and quietly started a small side project that I'd been dreaming about for years, a freelance consulting service I could run online. Each email I sent, each client I secured, each milestone I hit felt like a small act of rebellion, a way of proving to myself that my worth wasn't tied to Rachel's approval or Mom's complicity. It was mine and mine alone. But just as I began to feel the first real taste of progress, the tension at home escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Rachel, sensing my growing independence, began to lash out more aggressively. It started with passive-aggressive comments about wasting my time, with online courses, escalated to stealing documents and personal items from my room, and culminated in moments of outright sabotage. One morning, I discovered that she had unplugged my laptop while I was asleep, deleting unsaved drafts I had been working on for weeks. Another time, she borrowed a notebook filled with project ideas and left it in the rain, soaking it completely. Each incident was calculated, precise, and cruel, designed to make me feel powerless and question my own ability to succeed outside her sphere. What surprised me most, though, was Mom. She didn't intervene. She didn't scold Rachel. She didn't offer comfort. Instead, she would sigh, shake her head, and mutter something like, "Nick, you should have known better," or "Rachel isn't intentionally trying to hurt you." Those words were like acid on my determination, but rather than crushing me, they reinforced something I'd known all along. I could no longer rely on anyone in my family to validate me. I had to build my own foundation. By the end of that month, I had reached a turning point. I had secured a small contract through my freelance consulting, enough to give me a modest income, and I had several job interviews lined up, including one at a company I'd admired for years. The sense of accomplishment was intoxicating, not because I was rubbing it in Rachel's face, but because I finally felt like I was standing on my own 2 feet. I had become my own advocate, my own protector, and my own source of validation. However, the house remained a battlefield. Rachel's provocations continued, more desperate and reckless with each passing day. She started leaving passive-aggressive notes on my desk, accidentally spilling drinks on my workspace, and even trying to manipulate Mom into restricting my movements, framing me as selfish or unreasonable. Each attempt to undermine me was a reminder that my journey wasn't going to be easy, that the fight for respect and autonomy wouldn't be won overnight. One evening, I returned from a long day of interviews and work, only to find Rachel sitting in the living room, phone in hand, recording me again. I didn't know what she planned, but the look on her face told me it wasn't innocent. "Why do you always have to act so serious?" she asked, feigning concern. "Can't you just relax for once?" I didn't answer. I had learned that silence could be more powerful than words. Instead, I walked past her, my mind already racing through scenarios, strategies, and contingencies. Every interaction, every glance, every subtle manipulation she attempted was now data, fuel for the plan I was quietly building. I was no longer reactive. I was strategic. I was calm, calculated, and increasingly confident in my ability to shift the balance without losing control. By the time I went to bed that night, the sense of tension in the house had transformed into something I could almost measure, a taut line stretched between us, vibrating with potential energy. Rachel had thrown everything at me, trying to knock me down, but I had survived. I had grown stronger, sharper, and more resilient in ways I hadn't known I could. And for the first time in my life, I realized that the person I had to defeat wasn't just Rachel. It was the pattern itself, the dynamic that had kept me small for so long. I knew the next steps had to be precise. I needed leverage, timing, and patience. I needed to set the stage so that when I finally acted, there would be no ambiguity, no room for her lies or manipulations to take hold. And deep down, I felt a strange exhilaration. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about reclaiming my life, and about proving, finally, that I was capable of standing tall no matter how toxic the environment around me became. As I lay in bed that night, planning, calculating, and silently celebrating the small victories of the day, I realized something crucial. The fall had been necessary. Hitting rock bottom had stripped away all illusions, all reliance on anyone but myself, and in its place, I had begun to rise, not with anger, but with clarity, purpose, and determination. And for the first time, I felt like I was the one holding the reins, the one controlling the narrative, and the one who would decide how the next chapter unfolded. The first step in reclaiming control was understanding the battlefield. I couldn't just rush into confrontation or retaliation. It would play into Rachel's hands. She thrived on chaos, on emotional reactions, on moments where she could twist the story to make herself the victim and me the unreasonable one. No, this had to be strategic, quiet, calculated. I had to know the terrain, the players, and the patterns before I made my move. And now, with my confidence rebuilt and my own successes beginning to take shape, I was in the perfect position to do just that. I started by observing Rachel more closely than ever before. Every morning, she had the same routines. Coffee at exactly 7:15, scrolling through her phone while Mom read the newspaper, then lingering near the kitchen counter to see what I was doing. Her expression a careful mix of casual curiosity and subtle judgment. I noticed how she reacted when she thought I wasn't looking, rolling her eyes, smirking, whispering comments to Mom, or subtly sabotaging small things around me. Her ego was massive, but it was predictable. That predictability became my first advantage. Mom, on the other hand, was still frustratingly neutral. She'd glance at Rachel, then at me, then look away, often saying something like, "I don't want to get involved in your squabbles." But I realized that neutrality wasn't indifference. It was a blind spot I could exploit. Mom had always valued appearances and politeness, and she hated conflict that escalated beyond what she could control. So if I could engineer situations where Rachel's behavior became undeniable to anyone watching, Mom would either be forced to act or be exposed herself as complicit. That gave me leverage. I began documenting everything. Every small slight, every passive-aggressive remark, every act of sabotage. I created a private folder on my cloud account, labeled meticulously by date and event, with screenshots, photos, and even a few secret recordings of conversations where Rachel tried to manipulate or gaslight me. It felt almost therapeutic, like each piece of evidence I collected was a brick being laid in the foundation of the plan that would ultimately shift the balance. The more I documented, the more patterns emerged, and the more I realized just how methodical Rachel really was. Every accident had a traceable thread, a timing that revealed intent. I was starting to see the architecture of her cruelty, and it was exhilarating. Next, I worked on fortifying my own position. The freelance consulting work was gaining traction, and I secured a few additional clients who were reliable and professional. I also lined up a few more interviews in fields I'd only dreamed of entering, making sure that I had a financial buffer and career momentum independent of the house I'd been trapped in. Every success I achieved quietly chipped away at Rachel's perceived control over me. It wasn't just symbolic. My growing independence meant she couldn't sabotage me without consequences I controlled. But the real game changer came when I realized I had allies I hadn't acknowledged before. One of my clients was a longtime friend of the family, someone who'd always respected me and noticed Rachel's manipulations. Another was a colleague from an online course who had firsthand experience with entitlement and toxicity in personal relationships. Both were willing to offer advice and, more importantly, subtle assistance without interfering directly. The realization was liberating. I didn't have to face Rachel alone. I just had to maneuver carefully so that my moves appeared organic rather than orchestrated. With the groundwork laid, I began planting seeds for confrontation. These weren't dramatic gestures or threats. They were subtle, strategic nudges designed to provoke predictable reactions from Rachel. I started leaving my projects in plain sight, making sure she knew I had rebuilt them stronger than before. I mentioned upcoming interviews casually, letting her overhear but not giving her direct access. I documented every small attempt she made to undermine me, knowing that eventually, the cumulative evidence would be undeniable. I also began exploiting her ego. Rachel had always thrived on the idea that she was cleverer than everyone else, that she could outsmart and manipulate without consequence. I played into this, pretending to be caught off guard, letting her think she had the upper hand, while quietly setting up situations where her own actions would expose her. I let her believe she could continue sabotaging me, confident that I was aware and ready, and that any misstep on her part would be magnified by the careful documentation I'd amassed. One particularly useful tactic was leveraging Mom's sense of decorum. Mom hated confrontations that looked messy or public. I started staging small interactions in her presence, subtle enough that she couldn't immediately intervene, but clear enough that she would notice Rachel's behavior. Rachel's passive aggressiveness became more pronounced when she thought Mom was watching, giving me invaluable insight into how she behaved under pressure. I started predicting her reactions with frightening accuracy, planning the right moves to push her further without tipping her off that she was being cornered. At the same time, I quietly enhanced my own personal space. I secured my workspace, backed up all files in multiple locations, and even implemented small security measures to prevent Rachel from accessing my devices. Each precaution wasn't just practical, it was psychological. It reinforced to me that I was no longer vulnerable in the same way, that my life, my success, and my dignity were no longer dependent on her whims. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house became almost tangible. Rachel's behavior grew increasingly reckless, a combination of frustration and fear at the subtle but undeniable shift in power. She'd try to provoke arguments, leave accusatory notes, or attempt minor sabotage, but each attempt only reinforced my resolve and added to the growing dossier of evidence. Mom watched, quietly tense, and I could sense that the imbalance was becoming more obvious even to her. She still didn't intervene directly, but I noticed small cracks, hesitations in her speech, tighter expressions, the way she avoided Rachel's eye when she started to act out. Then, finally, I found the perfect opportunity. It came in the form of a family gathering, an anniversary dinner for one of Mom's friends, a formal but intimate event with several people who respected me and had observed Rachel's manipulations over the years. The setting was ideal, public enough that Rachel's behavior could be seen, intimate enough that I could control the narrative and ensure that the right people noticed the truth. I began planning carefully, envisioning exactly how each interaction would unfold, predicting Rachel's reactions, and laying contingencies for Mom's likely responses. I spent nights rehearsing scenarios in my head, anticipating every possible angle. Every word Rachel might say, every gesture she might make, every attempt to deflect or manipulate. Each was cataloged and countered with a planned response. I wasn't just preparing to defend myself. I was preparing to orchestrate a situation where the truth would be undeniable, where the scales would finally tip, and where Rachel's manipulations would collapse under the weight of evidence, observation, and precision. By the time the day arrived, I felt calm, focused, and ready. The months of planning, rebuilding, and quiet strategy had culminated in a moment where I would finally seize control. I knew the night could be volatile. Rachel would likely sense the shift, act out, or try to sabotage the plan. Mom might still hesitate, but I had built contingencies, allies, and momentum that I could rely on. As I dressed for the evening, checking my notes and quietly reviewing the evidence I had compiled, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and dread. This was the point of no return. Everything I had done over the past few months, the rebuilding, the observation, the strategy, had led to this setup. The next few hours could change the dynamic in our family forever. Rachel would either continue her pattern of entitlement and manipulation, or the cracks in her armor would finally be exposed in a way she couldn't deny, twist, or escape. I took a deep breath, reminded myself of the months of work and quiet victories, and stepped out the door. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to my sister's cruelty. I was directing the narrative, guiding the momentum, and setting the stage for a reckoning. The setup was complete. The pieces were in place. Now, all that remained was to execute and watch everything unfold exactly as planned. The evening of the dinner arrived, and everything felt electric, charged with anticipation. I knew Rachel would be on high alert, her ego bristling at any sign of independence or competence from me. But I also knew the stakes were mine to control. I arrived early, dressed neatly, carrying a subtle folder that contained my evidence. The venue was small, warm, with low lighting and soft chatter, the kind of environment where a single word, a subtle action, or a quiet revelation could carry tremendous weight. I felt my pulse steady, a mixture of nerves and satisfaction. Months of strategy, patience, and rebuilding my life had led to this moment, and there was no turning back. Rachel arrived shortly after, radiant in her usual performative way, laughing at things that weren't particularly funny and already casting glances toward me, trying to gauge how I would react. Mom trailed behind her, polite but tense, scanning the room and occasionally throwing me quick, cautious looks. I could feel the weight of observation from several other guests, all friendly acquaintances who had known our family dynamics for years and who subtly respected me even when Rachel had attempted to dominate every interaction. Everything was in my favor, if I kept my composure. The dinner began smoothly enough, polite chatter flowing, forks clinking, wine poured, and small talk filling the gaps. Rachel, predictably, made several attempts to provoke me. Flippant remarks about my career choices, sly digs at my hobbies, and passive-aggressive comments about how busy I must be trying to catch up with everyone else's success. I kept my reactions measured, letting her words float past like smoke. Each attempt she made only strengthened my confidence, because I knew the real reveal was yet to come. Midway through the meal, I casually pulled the folder from my bag and set it on the table in front of me, sliding it toward Rachel without making a scene. Her expression flickered, confusion and apprehension crossing her face, but she forced a smile and leaned back, pretending curiosity. I let it sit there, calm, confident, and in plain sight. "I think it's time to clear the air," I said quietly, my voice measured but firm, ensuring that several nearby guests caught the statement. "Rachel, everything I've experienced over the past few years, the lies, the sabotage, the manipulation, has been documented. Every action, every word, every attempt to undermine me has been recorded or captured in some way. I think it's time we address it openly." The room went slightly still. Rachel's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic she tried to hide behind forced laughter. "Nick, really? Here? In front of everyone?" she asked, her voice tense, betraying the first cracks in her carefully constructed facade. "Yes," I replied calm. "Here, because this isn't just about you and me anymore. It's about the truth being visible to those who have witnessed your behavior over the years." I opened the folder and started methodically laying out the evidence. Screenshots of her manipulative messages, photographs of sabotage projects, recordings of conversations where she tried to gaslight me, and even documentation of small but significant moments she had attempted to deny. Each piece was undeniable, factual, and presented without emotion. Let the evidence speak for itself. Rachel's composure unraveled slowly at first. She tried to interject, saying things like, "You're exaggerating, and that's not what happened." But the documents and recordings left no room for argument. I played a few of the recordings for everyone. including Mom, who now looked stunned, realizing the depth and consistency of Rachel's manipulations. The sounds of Rachel's voice, admitting things she had denied countless times, hung in the air, undeniable and uncompromising. Rachel's panic grew into visible frustration. She slapped her hand down on the table, her face red, her voice rising as she attempted to regain control. "This is ridiculous. You're making this a spectacle," she shouted, but even she knew the damage was done. Several of the guests, familiar with the family's history, exchanged glances that silently acknowledged what they had suspected all along. Rachel's carefully cultivated reputation of charm and wit couldn't survive the weight of truth displayed so methodically and publicly. Mom finally spoke, though hesitantly. "Rachel, I didn't realize." Her voice trailed off, guilt and shock mingling, as she realized that years of quiet complicity had allowed Rachel's behavior to flourish unchecked. "I didn't need her approval. I simply let her acknowledgement hang in the air, reinforcing the finality of the exposure." Rachel, seeing her influence crumble, shifted tactics desperately. She accused me of trying to humiliate her, of twisting things out of context, of being petty. But the evidence was comprehensive, organized, and undeniable. Each accusation she made only highlighted her own lack of credibility. She tried to cry, to appeal to sympathy, but the careful planning, the calm demeanor, and the presence of witnesses made it impossible for her to manipulate the narrative. As the dinner progressed, the atmosphere shifted decisively. Rachel's usual supporters, friends she had casually charmed over the years, began to distance themselves, murmuring quietly among themselves, no longer able to ignore the reality before them. The guests who had respected me now looked at Rachel with a mixture of shock and understanding, seeing the pattern I had endured for years laid bare. Mom sat in stunned silence, visibly processing how the past had been distorted and how her own inaction had contributed to the imbalance. By the end of the evening, Rachel was defeated in a way that was both satisfying and complete. She left the table abruptly, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, muttering about leaving early. Mom followed shortly after, her expression a mixture of guilt and newfound awareness, finally recognizing the consequences of her silence. I remained, quietly collecting my things, letting the gravity of the moment settle over everyone else. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, just a calm, undeniable truth that had been revealed, and a shift in the dynamic that would endure far longer than any argument could. Later, after the event, several guests approached me privately, praising my composure, intelligence, and the methodical way I had handled the situation. They expressed admiration for my patience, my strategy, and the courage it took to confront a manipulative family member in a public yet controlled setting. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was justice, clarity, and self-preservation, executed with precision and restraint. Rachel, in the aftermath, attempted to reconcile and reassert herself, but the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Her words now fell on ears that were no longer captive to her manipulations. Mom, too, had changed, finally aware of her own role in enabling behavior that had harmed me for years. While the family bond was complicated and the path forward would not be without tension, the balance had been corrected. For the first time, I felt empowered, unshackled, and respected. The most remarkable feeling wasn't triumph over Rachel. It was the recognition of my own resilience. I had been underestimated, manipulated, and minimized for years, yet I had turned the circumstances into a foundation for strength, independence, and self-worth. The power of calm, strategic action had replaced the years of frustration, and I now knew that nothing, not manipulation, entitlement, or favoritism, could take that away from me. That night, as I returned home alone, I paused at the door and looked back at the house, the place that had been both battleground and proving ground. I realized something profound. Victory wasn't about crushing my sister or proving her wrong. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my narrative in a way that could never be denied. I felt a quiet, steady satisfaction, a sense of closure and triumph that was both deep and unshakable. And as I turned off the lights and closed the door behind me, I whispered to myself, with a calm certainty that had been forged through months of struggle and strategy, "This is mine."